Acend has decided not to field a Valorant team in the 2025 season, and so I invited the CEO of the organization, Ben, and the general manager of esports, Crimson, to share their thoughts on why this decision was made and to shed some light on the future of Acend.
Yeah, hard decision, but at the end of the day, feels more like a lot of disrespect coming from Riot than appreciation for orcs investing in tier 2. That's how I felt about it. And remember, we had this conversation and we asked, what are the reasons for staying in Valorant tier 2? And nobody could really provide legitimate. I mean, we had one or two, but I think we had 10 reasons speaking against staying in tier 2 Valorant. So yeah, we can go a little more detail, but for me as a obviously esports enthusiast, but also as a businessman, man, you're putting in so much money, that's what you get. It's very disheartening.
Yeah. I think probably the talk started in more detail, I guess, when they announced the changes, which we already covered in another video, right?
Yeah.
But when they announced the changes to the Ascension system for next year, it immediately took a huge hit to our motivation to even become a VCT team, right? With the idea that you could only play for a year and then potentially immediately relegated. You've done all this effort, you've moved all the way to Berlin, you've put all this money into relocating and all of this, and then you're already starting from a back foot because the rest of the VCT teams are there, they're set up already, they potentially have better budgets than you, but I mean, that's arguable, right? But and then you have to come in and outperform them in order to keep your spot. That just feels like you are starting on such a back foot that how can you do that, So I think that's where it probably started for us, right? But there are obviously a lot of other systemic issues in tier 2 that we have seen with various news posts and things that are coming out, where it appears that in a number of, at the time of this recording at least, there's a couple of confirmed of these off-season tournaments that have been cancelled already, and as far as we know from the information we've received, it seems likely that the East Surge, where we were supposed to compete, will also have its off-season cancelled. It's not confirmed right now, but there's been no talk about it, and it was supposed to start in 2 weeks from now. I don't think it's going to happen. So that's a huge reason immediately is you're not playing any games, right? When did we confirm that we weren't able to play in Ascension, right? We didn't qualify for Ascension, fair enough, but from that point there have been no games, and there will be no games until February, so that's 6 months, right? And obviously paying the salaries and that sort of thing for a team that is not doing anything is hard to justify.
Yeah, and it's not even just this. I'm not sure if I recall the time frame properly, but even if you don't manage to qualify for Ascension, there's no motivation for the team to do anything, because you're still gonna have champions. You're gonna have then afterwards Ascension. There's gonna be teams having a week or 2 weeks off. By the time you can start trialing new players, it's a lot of time is gone. What you can do is tell the guys, yeah, scrim, stay sharp, do content, but it's almost 2 months real off season. The previous years when we didn't manage to qualify, we went out of Ascension, maybe there was a week or 2 weeks off, and then you started potentially rebuilding the roster if you had to. You started trialing, so there was something going on even in the off season. But this was just all right, because most of the teams you want to try, they still compete in Ascension or they compete at VCT, and then afterwards, right, there's all right, these guys are free, they're going to be leaving the teams, whether it's, I don't know, Gentlemates or Navi, and then you have multiple agents you want to be looking at, agents, free agents, players that you can look into. Same for tier 2, right? So you have different regions, everyone has different deadlines, and it felt what are we actually doing here for a month or 2 months almost? And yeah, and as you just said, no games at all, no officials now until the end of the year. Come on. And this is where I think if there's seriously someone caring about tier 2, Riot would jump in. You know what, guys, we're going to do similar to Red Bull Homeground, a tier 2 tournament, 50k prize pool, 20k prize, whatever it is at the end of the year. the top 2, top 3 from all regions with, group stage, whatnot. It's not, even if it's just an online event, it's not that difficult. But
Yeah,
it is what it is.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that there are some, because people will say, oh, there are off-season events you can play in and that sort of thing. But from my understanding, again, at the point of this recording, there is maybe one in EU that you can qualify for with a single qualifier spot, which I think is the Red Bull home ground, right? If I'm not mistaken on the details. And everything else is like these campus clutches and these various other tournaments, Spike Nations and stuff, all very cool tournaments. And it's great to see that there are other types of tournaments happening in Valorant outside of VCT, but they do not benefit us, right? We can't play in Spike Nations because we are not a country, right? Like these things are useless to an organization. It might be great if your players get the opportunity to go and play in Spike Nations, but frankly, it doesn't do anything for an organization to have those events. So to sit there and say, hey, we've got nothing to play until next year is crazy,
Yeah, absolutely. It's a super difficult system to function in as an organization. And that's not where the problems end either, is it? Because there's sort of like this weird parasitic relationship, for lack of a better term, between the tier 1 teams and tier 2 teams as far as signing players during the offseason and how the roster locks and the schedules line up. Would you be able to share a little bit of insight as the general manager, kind of like what it's like to try and compete with tier 1 teams for players in the offseason?
Yeah, I think 100% it comes down to, the problem is as well, there's sort of this 2-tier system where there's teams that went to champions and there's teams that didn't. So initially the teams that didn't go to champions, they may be looking to make roster moves and whatever as champions is happening, but they also need to wait for Ascension to happen. So everything is very slow because maybe they want to take players from the Ascension teams or the ones that don't qualify, right? And then after champions, you're still waiting because the better teams in EU, the ones that made it to champions, they come back and then they're also potentially making roster changes and then they add into the mix. And all of that time, you are in this kind of limbo where you're saying, hey, maybe we have all 5 players next year and maybe we have 2 players, right? Because if these teams come along and decide they want to, pick the players up, there's obviously a benefit and that's, in many tier 2 situations in other esports, maybe there is a benefit to selling your players on, right? And it can be a revenue stream for some teams, but the amount of time that you have to essentially waste being unable to make any plans to do anything with that is very difficult to manage and very difficult to then turn that situation to your advantage, right? If you're already investing all of this money, then frankly, the buyouts in Valorant are not enough to pay the downtime that you spend for selling players up into tier 1, right? It's not CS where these players are going for millions of dollars, right? Let's just be honest about it. And so those kind of sales are great for the players, but they're not making a huge dent in the organization's finances or expenditure in that time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially after Ascension, usually the way you have to imagine is teams finish and then, they go a bit of on vacation, then they come back and then they brainstorm, who do we want to keep, who we're going to be releasing. So even once champions or then Ascension has finished, there's going to be another 2 weeks where you actually know which players are going to be available. And also, as you mentioned, for the tier 1 orgs, it takes them weeks to decide who they want to be trialing out. So by the time you can really, okay, the core of players, who's going to stay, probably we would start now.
Yeah.
Right? And that's like since our last game or like 2 months ago.
Yeah, so there's multiple reasons why, and I think it's pretty clear. I think we have a lot of good ideas potentially for fixing tier 2, right? And I hope that Riot sees the problems the organizations are having. But yeah, maybe that's a topic for another video.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact of the matter is that Acend is not going to be the last team to pull out of tier 2. And it's not because we want to leave. We want to be part of Valorant esports. We have a legacy here. We almost have a responsibility as the first world champion of the game to try and make it work. But the fact of the matter is that it's just not a viable business strategy to be in tier 2. And we would love to see that change. And so we're hoping to have as many of these types of conversations as possible. And we'll post as many of them as we can over on our other channel, Inside Esports, where we're trying to kind of pull the curtain back on what it's like to run an org and sort of provide a little bit more transparency than the industry tends to give on the day-to-day operations of being in esports. So make sure you check out that channel. And don't worry, we will still be posting our podcast here and doing content about Valorant. We're just not operating a team in 2025, but hopefully we'll see you again on the server in the future.
It is our distinct honor to crown our inaugural VCT champions. Give it up for Acend!